Welcome to Tales from the Jar Side, the video series. If you don't feel like reading my newsletter, that's fine. I'll be happy to read it to you. My name is Ken Cousin, and let's get started. So the title this week is Tales from the Jar Side, Mockito Answers, Android, Kotlin, and Gradle, oh my, the Notes disaster, a new part-time job, and tweets and toots. The subtitle, which is a joke usually, this time it's, what do you call a starving hippopotamus in Budapest? A hungry hippo. Finally remembered to prepare my rim shot ahead of time. Okay, let's go. Welcome, fellow jarheads, to Tales from the Jar Side, the Cousin IT newsletter for the week of April 9th through 16th, 2023. This week I taught week 2 of my Android Developer Bootcamp course, which brought up a lot of issues, and my 2-day Getting Started with Spring and Spring Boot course, both on the O'Reilly Learning platform. Regular readers of and listeners to, and of course video viewers of this newsletter are affectionately known as jarheads, and are far more intelligent, sophisticated, and attractive than the average newsletter reader or listener or viewer. If you wish to become a jarhead, please subscribe to the newsletter on the button provided, or you can go to youtube.com/@talesfromthejarside, and there's a subscribe button there as well. Looks like I am up to 180 subscribers now. Progress. Okay, first section, Mockito Answers. So this week's technical content, which of course you feel free to skip if you're not interested, of course that's true about every section, is about a new video I posted on the Tales from the Jar Side YouTube channel entitled The Argument is the Answer. The subtitle this time was Custom Answers from Mockito Mocks. It's an interesting problem. It's something that I struggled with for a while, and because the documentation didn't make clear to me, at any rate, how to solve the problem I had. But it turns out it's remarkably simple. So, as I say in the newsletter, it turns out that what I needed was a straightforward implementation of the answer interface as part of the setting expectations on a mock. I'll say when I want a certain method invoked on a dependency, then answer and provide an answer. Now, the answer can be implemented as a anonymous inner class, which is what people did for a while. Then when Java 8 Lambdas came along, it turned out that the Mockito team kind of got lucky here, because the answer interface is what they call a single abstract method interface, and therefore you can implement it with a simple Lambda expression. And that's what I had in the book. It turns out, however, that as soon as I published the book, or recently after it, I discovered when reading somebody else's blog post that there's an even easier way to handle this. And in fact, inside the Mockito API, there's a class called, of all things, Additional Answers. And that class has a method called returns first argument. There's also a returns last argument or returns argument with an index. So in other words, they provided a nice static method shortcut to accessing an individual argument in the method list. All I needed was the first argument, so I was able to write that up as well. All of those variations are in the GitHub repository for the book inside the person service, using the person repository as the mocked dependency. So I have a link here to the GitHub repository for the book, which is right... Wow, I got to redirect. Let's try this again. Oh, previous page is sending you to that. Oh, I see. Yes, this is going to tie into our new little notes facility. They really want me to go to restack things and use notes and everything. No, I wanted to go to the actual GitHub repository. And here it is. So it's at github.com/cousin/Mockito book. In case you're interested. Let's see what happens if I click on my Mockito Made Clear link. That one went directly there. How about that? So I'm not sure what the distinction was in that particular case. If you know, please let me know. Though I imagine I'll stumble across it enough times it'll become obvious. At any rate, there's the Mockito Made Clear book from Pragmatic Programmers. Let's go to the next section. Android and Kotlin and Gradle. Oh my. Frequent readers of this newsletter know that I kind of have a like/hate relationship with Android development. It never reaches the level of love that some people have, that Google would like me to have. And the hate side isn't really hate, although it's more of a sadly shaking my head in disgust, or sometimes a little stronger than that, but I'll digress. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been teaching this Android development bootcamp on the O'Reilly Learning Platform. That's a 3-week course. The first week was basically just Kotlin, and then these 2 weeks we're doing Android. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Android, you'll know that 2 4-hour weeks is nowhere near enough time to learn Android. But we cover a lot of ground and give you an idea what's available. It's a survey as much as anything. But, of course, it's been a couple months since I taught it, which meant it was time to update the tools again. And Android changes all the time, and Android Studio certainly changes all the time, and so does Gradle, for example, and Gradle's the default build tool for Android. Making this even more imperative is that this week was also Kotlin Conf. Let's click on that link. That one went directly there. This is the webpage kotlinconf.com, which was for the conference. They have a link to the opening keynote. It's also on YouTube, which I think I embedded in the newsletter. But it was held in Amsterdam. They have attendees from all over the place. And of course, you can see the schedule and speakers and workshops and so on. Now, Amsterdam's kind of a hike for me. I've been there once or twice, and it's a beautiful place. I love going there. But since I wasn't giving a talk and I didn't really have anything to propose in the first place, I'm more of a user than I didn't have anything innovative to say that I didn't think was already going to be covered. So I didn't plan to go. Right before the pandemic, they were planning to hold one. I think it was in Montreal, and that one I would have gone to. But going back to Europe again this year, no, I decided not to do that. I'm trying rather unsuccessfully, I must admit, to limit my travel these days. I'll mention something about that later. So since I wasn't speaking, I decided not to go, but I did keep track of developments. The conference demonstrated once again the determination of the Kotlin team to get people to use Kotlin for multi-platform development. Kotlin multi-platform mobile. I mean, if you just go to the kotlinlang.org homepage, right on the front, they're talking about cross-platform. Let me make that a little bit smaller. And multi-platform is the first thing they mention. Then they talk about server-side, and then they go back to multi-platform libraries again, and it's over and over. They really do care about this, multi-platform development. So clearly they see this as their niche, their market opportunity. It's a way to make progress. I say in the newsletter, I think that's a serious mistake. Now, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. I think that their multi-platform capabilities are quite impressive. And I know a few people, like search for John O'Reilly, for example, on Twitter, and he does a wonderful job demonstrating multi-platform capabilities, both on Android and iOS using Swift UI, and keeping the business logic and the rest of it, everything non-UI, in Kotlin code and deploying on both platforms, but then using the specific UI tools for that platform for the rest. Now that's fine, except there's some issues with that. First of all, I mentioned the history of cross-platform toolkits is not a pretty one. There have been a lot of attempts that never seem to work out right. Also, while it's not that hard to convince Android people to use Kotlin even on iOS devices, the problem you run into there is most Android developers don't really know the APIs and how iOS works, and therefore they're kind of reluctant to work with it because what happens if something goes wrong? They don't know how to debug it. But then it's a disaster trying to get iOS people to use Kotlin. I mean, they see no reason in many cases to leave their, quote, walled garden around all the Apple products. It's sometimes very difficult to get people to leave the so-called cult of Steve, if you will. I'm one of those somewhat cross-platform people in the sense that I use a Mac for all my development, but I use Android for my mobile development. But then again, I'm a Java person and a Kotlin person, and that combination makes sense. So even I'm kind of reluctant to get into iOS. Frankly, as an aside, I mentioned this last week, I saw a presentation at DevNexus on JavaFX's ability to write the app in JavaFX and deploy it everywhere. That looks quite promising, although, again, a problem with these cross-platform toolkits is if you're not using anything native, the app never quite looks right when compared to native apps on each platform. At any rate, as a Kotlin person, I occasionally get calls about teaching Kotlin classes. I wrote a book on it, my little Kotlin cookbook. Let's see if that one goes to where it's supposed to go as well. Yes, that's a book inside the O'Reilly Learning Platform. That's where my link took me. But if you just went to the base O'Reilly part, actually, no, that stayed. Yeah, that's about right. At any rate, it's available. I occasionally get calls about teaching Kotlin classes. I'm also, for the time being anyway, a training partner with JetBrains on Kotlin. But I've gotten very few contacts through that channel, and they charge a lot of money for it, or they're going to start charging me a lot of money, and I doubt I'm going to follow up. At any rate, when I get contacts about Kotlin training, mostly it's companies that have teams of Android people. Occasionally, and this is fortunately starting to grow, I get more general comments about, oh, can you teach Kotlin? And we're just using, say, for example, Spring. And that's wonderful. But we'll see. I have not yet, even once, gotten contacted about multi-platform development. Now, that's anecdotal, and I'm not exactly known in that space, so it's probably not a big surprise. But nobody asking at all, that's just gets me the sense that the market isn't that big right now. Personally, I think JetBrains would be much better served by pushing Kotlin as a server-side development language to compete with or even replace Java. As I mentioned, the Spring framework is quite friendly with Kotlin and even has coroutines under the hood. And that, I thought, was their huge market opportunity. Coroutines are virtual threads, but in the Kotlin space, and they even already have structured concurrency. When this stuff was brought into the Android space, when Android adopted Kotlin, and therefore coroutines as a way to get off the UI thread, the reactive APIs kind of almost vanished overnight. Everybody went to the coroutines, and now that's built into so many Android libraries, nobody would think of doing anything any other way. Spring still has the reactive capabilities. In fact, I'm teaching a reactive Spring course this week. But nobody, I mean, even though they support Kotlin and therefore you have coroutines, the adoption rate, again, it's been pretty small, mostly because the huge vast majority of Spring developers are Java people. It would require them to change languages to go to Kotlin in order to use coroutines. You cannot use the Kotlin coroutines from Java. But I think that's where the opportunity was. I think they had a couple years before Java was going to introduce virtual threads. Why not take advantage of it to do something that would replace something everybody acknowledges is difficult? That being the virtual threads, the reactive part, on Spring. But they didn't do that. And of course, Java 21, which is coming out in September, is scheduled to include virtual threads, although probably not structured concurrency, and one without the other can get dicey. At any rate, the window of advantage that Kotlin had over Java is narrowing and is eventually going to come to a close. And then we'll see. So I think they missed their shot. I really do. I'm really kind of sad about it because it's very promising. I really enjoyed Groovy, and Groovy's already been delegated to a not as popular language, although I still love it and there's still plenty of activity in it. I don't want to see Kotlin go the same way, or more likely what will happen is Kotlin will get relegated to its Android niche and never break out of that. But we'll see. Coming back to Android, one of the big moments at Kotlin Conf was that they announced the next version, the current version now, of Android Studio, which is codenamed Giraffe. And that, the current version of Android Studio just came out, which starts with an F, that's Flamingo. They announced at Kotlin Conf that Giraffe, starting with Giraffe, the Gradle build file for Android apps is going to default to be written in the Kotlin DSL, the Kotlin domain-specific language. That's a big change. Now, they've had the option for quite a while to select a Kotlin DSL for your Gradle build file, But most Android developers are familiar with the build file, but they don't really focus on it. They're much more interested in their app, and therefore they tend to just take the defaults. And this is an odd blend of knowing something about Groovy, speaking of Groovy, because that's the DSL in the default version of Gradle, and then Kotlin DSL. And the Kotlin DSL has for years had a reputation of being nice at the beginning, but rapidly running into problems, especially with performance issues. Well, now they're going to switch, and that makes sense, actually. For Android people, they're already Kotlin people. Might as well have the build DSL also written in Kotlin, although there's still a learning curve there. Of course, Gradle loves this, and it just always reminds me of this analogy, which they probably wouldn't like. Whenever I see a move by Gradle to push their Kotlin DSL rather than the Groovy DSL, I'm reminded of the scene in the classic movie The Sting, Robert Redford, Paul Newman, etc., where the con men are discussing their mark, the target, which is Doyle Lonigan, the gangster, and one of them says, "But my guess, he's just trying to build himself a respectable image. He came out of 5 points, but he's been telling everybody he was born in Forest Hills." Gradle seems to take the attitude that Groovy never heard of it. We don't know Groovy. We like Kotlin. We like Java. We've implemented everything in Java, and we've got a Kotlin DSL. But I remember this. I was there when Gradle was created, and it was an offshoot of a couple of Groovy DSLs. It started with Groovy Ant and migrated from there. And it took forever for them to build up to Gradle 1.0, and then it was one of the main reasons people used to learn Groovy for a long time. And then they switched a few years later to incorporate a Kotlin DSL, which I assumed at the time they did because they were in partnership with JetBrains, who runs Kotlin, and that was going to help the user experience. It was going to help the code assist inside of the IDE. And it has, and it hasn't. I mean, IntelliJ does pretty well with both, frankly. But nevertheless, you talk to Gradle people now, and they seem to pretend like, oh yeah, Groovy, we don't care about Groovy. Yeah, we support it, but they never even bring it up. But they love Kotlin, and they love the Kotlin DSL. I don't know why they're so dedicated to this, but they're trying to make it happen, and it's happening, but it's, again, slow adoption. As I say in the newsletter, I don't really know New York. I don't know 5 points from Forest Hills from Piscataway, New Jersey. Beyond the names and vague ideas about them. But somebody at Gradle really seems to care about this difference. They came out of Groovy, but they want to pretend they came out of Java or Kotlin, and I don't know why. The Groovy community is still the greatest bunch of developers I've ever met, the most humble geniuses I've ever known, and I love working with them. It's such a pleasure, and I'm always honored to be associated with them in any way, partly for the Groovy podcast and partly through my book, my first book, Making Java Groovy. That's this one at Manning, which, believe it or not, is still earning royalties, even though September 2013, this year is going to be, oh my goodness, the 10-year anniversary of Making Java Groovy. The first time I saw the book, first time I actually had a physical copy, was at a Spring 1 2GX conference. 2GX for Groovy, Grails, Gradle, Griffin, a whole bunch of projects. Held, I think, in New Orleans, as I recall. Back in 2013, we had a box shipped there so I could give them out during my presentations, which were well attended, by the way. Groovy was still pretty hot back then. I remember my first thought opening that box and taking out the book was, that's it? It took me like 3 years of 2 separate publishers and maybe 4 or 5 editors to go through. There's the story there. And the end of it was, I don't know, it was not trivially thin, but it was kind of thin. I was like, oh man, but I still liked it and I'm still happy about it. And as I mentioned here, the most recent royalties report I have for it from Manning was from the fourth quarter of 2022, and it earned me a whopping $18.62 for that quarter, which, hey, for a book that's almost 10 years old, okay, I'll take it. Lunch that day was on me, as long as you're okay with like a 6-inch sandwich at Subway and we're willing to get your own soda, Coming back to the present, this week, right after my class on Wednesday night, so I did my Android course in the so-called APAC time zones, I got a prompt that Android Studio was ready to update to its just released Flamingo version. I'm really, really glad that I got that prompt both after the class rather than before, because boy, that upgrade caused me some issues. In case you hadn't noticed, the versions of Android Studio these days are alphabetical and they're all referring to animals. E was electric eel, for example, and now we're on flamingo and giraffe is next. Each upgrade always seems to break something despite Google's assurances that this is wonderful. But I hit a surprise immediately. I tried to make a new app. And here's the picture you get on that new app. And it says, oh, I want to start an empty activity. That's what I usually do, especially when I'm teaching a training class. Let's keep it minimal, just get some starter code and go. But the icon doesn't look like it used to look. And, spoiler alert, the icon that I used to use is the one right below it, the one now called Empty Views Activity. And this is a change that Android Studio has made. Empty activity is now what they used to call empty compose activity, meaning you're using Jetpack Compose whether you intended to or not. If you don't want to use Jetpack Compose, you have to go with empty views activity, just like there's a basic views and there's others, but that's the size of the picture I chose. There's more options as well. So the word views is for non-compose. In other words, they changed the default, and that's sneaky. That's that I didn't expect. And that should be, labeled with bold letters, hey, we changed the default, not, oh, we're going to slip this by you. So I mentioned that surprise. And for those who are not aware, Jetpack Compose is Google's alternative user interface toolkit. And it's pushed very hard by Google. Google's been pushing this for almost a couple years now as a way to create a user interface in code. Now, from the beginning of Android, their user interface was created in XML, and nobody really liked that. Nobody was happy about that. Even when they introduced it, XML was no longer very popular as a way to, it's a great way to transfer information with metadata, but it's kind of hard to read. It's more written for people for computers to read, not for people. At any rate, now you can generate your user interface in Kotlin code, and it's not trivial Kotlin code, but it's a series of Kotlin functions in a very procedural style, very much so. And Google released it back, as I looked it up, it was the end of July of 2021, which doesn't sound that long ago, but that's almost 20 months, or a little over 20 months, I actually checked, just under 2 years. And the adoption hasn't been anywhere near the rate that I think Google wanted. And this is a picture of the homepage that has the Jetpack Compose information in it. You can vaguely see here, if I bring that up, that we have a little DSL, like a card with a column with an image and an animated visibility and a text and all these parameters that go inside it. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. They even have a little preview that updates, and the update's gotten better and better with each version of Android Studio. But that's the style that they want us to adopt. So during the keynote address at KotlinConf, there was a comment about Google reporting that nearly, I think it was 23% of the top apps in the Google Play Store use Jetpack Compose. And I was really surprised they admitted that, because that's not a big number. That's less than a quarter of all the major apps have adopted this after 2 years of Google pushing this on the homepage and trying to drive home the advantages here over and over again, and people having a basic dislike of XML just to start with, and yet they've only got 23%. I'm like, okay. And it looks like somebody at Google finally went, okay, we're going to force this by making it the default. Now, I don't have any insider information on that, but that's what it feels like to me. So if you don't deliberately avoid it now you're using Jetpack Compose. Now, I opened up the What's New in Flamingo page inside the IDE, and about halfway down, buried, is this little wizard here, or this snippet that says, Android Studio Flamingo includes new templates for creating a project or a module. By default, templates use Compose Material 3. Now, Material 3 is a user interface toolkit. Unless they are specified as views templates. We recommend using the Compose Material 3 templates, for example, empty activity as the best practice for creating an Android app, but they don't say why it's a best practice. They just say it is, and you should be using it, which they've been pushing for quite some time. So I mentioned this in the newsletter. Now, Google recently updated, like less than a month ago, this tutorial on Android basics with Compose. And I'm actually looking at this now. For a long time, it only had a couple of units, the first app and building your UI and everything, and I didn't do much with it. But they've now added in navigation and app architecture, which I really care about because I have to see how this fits in with things like view model and navigation, etc. Then they have the mechanism that works with both the retrofit library for network access and for RESTful web services, and Coil for images. Then they get to room persistence and the work manager and Compose with views. In other words, of all those units, I definitely want to go through the first 6 and maybe 7 and 8. And I'm working my way through now because it's finally time for me to admit that if I'm going to teach this stuff, I really need to help with this. So I have nothing against it, really. I'm not thrilled with the programming model, this procedural mechanism that feels like they're using, state hoisting is just another way of making global data. I mean, I was a procedural programmer in Fortran. We have functions with a dozen arguments or more. And didn't object-oriented programming get rid of all that? Wasn't that kind of the goal? And they kind of forgot about objects now. I mean, the widgets are objects, but at any rate, I'll rant on that another time. And now it's time for me to learn it. The problem, of course, is that then I tried to make an app. And when I tried to make an app, I ran into problems immediately. One problem I hit is that, and I still haven't figured this one out, is whenever I create a new project, the Gradle version uses a JDK that's a Java 1.8 JDK, and I can't get it to stop doing that. And the latest version of the Android Gradle plugin, AGP, requires Java 17, believe it or not. It's like, whoa, that's a big jump. That should have been a big information news item as well. So first thing I have to do in every app is go into the settings and change my Gradle JDK to use an installation I have of Java 17 because it doesn't do it no matter what I do. So at any rate, then it says, oh, and here we could upgrade your Android Gradle plugin because the default is still something in the 7 sequence, and they want to go up to 8, the brand new one. 8's the one that requires Java 17. So I upgrade to 8, at which point I get all these errors because the errors say, wait a minute, you've got 2 versions of each of these libraries in there. What are you going to do about that? Now, Gradle's supposed to resolve that, but it doesn't here. So what I found eventually is how to tell the app in the top-level build.gradle file that the org.jetbrains.kotlin.android plugin is the same version as the Kotlin version, 1.8.20. And that fixes that problem, but introduces a new one, which is that in the apps build.gradle file, there's a setting called Kotlin compiler extension version, which has to be upgraded to 1.4.5. It took me a while to track all this down. And this is normal with Android. Every time they change something, they make it harder or more complicated or break something. It's just not simple to do simple things. And I'm sorry, that's my experience with it. But again, it's still the way to create Android apps. And once you get past all this stuff, it's actually pretty good. So I was tempted to make a video on that, and I don't know, we'll see, because that's going to get dated really fast when they change things again, but it might be worth it. So after I did all that, then I had a running application and environment, and I could follow some of the steps. But I got to tell you, I'm going through that tutorial, and already things look dated. Already some things are out of date. Believe it or not. That's how fast things change in the Android world. Okay, the other problem I have is basically an old man rant, I suppose. It's that each section is introduced with a little video in this tutorial I'm talking about. And the tutorial features these people from Google, and they are relentless in their cheerfulness. They are so happy and so excited that you're doing this. And isn't this fun and wonderful? And, when people are confused, they don't want to hear jokes. When they're trying to figure something out, they don't want you, just the fact, what it means is you're bored. Instructors who make jokes up in the front, they're bored because they already know all this material and they're doing something to entertain themselves. It's not about you, it's about the students. And they think that by celebrating the fact that the students are learning, this is so great. Now, I get it. I want to encourage the students as well. But I prefer to say, look, let me give you the information you need. And then if it starts getting boring, we'll make a gag. And I always find humor is a high risk, high reward feature of training. There should be enough humor to keep things from being too dry, too frustrating. But when people are frustrated, when they are lost, when they're confused, just stop with the humor. They're not going to appreciate it. That's a bad time for it. The other problem, of course, with these people in these videos is they use a very diverse group of people. And that's great. I'm glad they have a diverse workforce. I really am. But this is a tutorial that's for a very large English-speaking audience. Please use people who can speak English in a way that's understandable. I have a tough time. Now, I know plenty of people from all sorts of places all over the world. I have friends from lots of places. The developer community has diversity issues, definitely. But we are a very international community. And therefore, I've heard accents from everywhere. I sometimes have to ask people to slow down a little bit so I can understand what they're saying a little bit better. But when you're making videos for the world, I think they should try a little harder to get people to speak more clearly or at least slow them down a little bit, make it more understandable. Now, maybe I'm an old man ranting at clouds, okay, sorry, but it's my experience again. I dread those videos. They really should cut back on the caffeine, though. Oh, my goodness. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the fiasco that was the launch of Substack Notes. Now, last week, I talked about the Twitter overreaction of Elon Musk throwing a temper tantrum again in last week's newsletter about Substack Notes. Now, here's the Notes product, or rather, this is the introduction to it. And I've got the link here and talking about how, they go on and an economic engine and, oh my goodness, and, all the motherhood and apple pie. We're going to change the world with a Twitter clone. Now, they don't say it's a Twitter clone. In fact, they don't believe it's a Twitter clone. They have all kinds of reasons. And honestly, when they announced it, I'm like, I got enough social media sites. I don't need that too. But then Elon massively overreacted, as you can see in my newsletter from last week, and cut off all Substack links. And then, you can read about it. There's an article from The Verge that summarizes everything nicely. And that's the classic Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is in Wikipedia. It basically refers to a time when Streisand was Barbara Streisand, the singer, was accused of something legally and she hated it and wanted to make it go away. But unfortunately, her overreaction to it spread the publicity about it far and wide. And that's what it's about. It's an attempt to hide, remove, or censor information that leads to increasing awareness of the information. It's an unintended consequence. So I thought, okay, if Elon's that upset about it, let me give it a try. So I put in a note, and here was my note that I posted. I said, I doubt it's a coincidence that after Elon's tantrum about Notes last week, his online argument with Paul Graham, also major investor in Substack, about them, suddenly Notes became open to all. So that's what happened this week. They opened up Notes right away. I wonder if they jumped the gun because of Elon. I don't know. Anyway, welcome. And I pointed out my newsletter and I said, feel free to comment and everything. And I got a couple likes, but nobody commented. And so far, nobody's commented on anything I've posted. So, okay. I'm not objecting. I didn't exactly send out email about it. I'm just trying to experiment, just trying to see what it's like. But my experimentations hit a stumbling block. There's this article by Mike Masnick in the the publication called Tech Dirt, and this actually read better on mobile, believe it or not. It said Substack CEO Chris Best doesn't realize he's just become the Nazi bar. And he talks about what happened, and this tweet made the rounds. This is actually a TikTok video, which is an excerpt from an interview that Nilay Patel on his podcast had, where he interviewed Chris Best, the head of Substack. And it is an unmitigated disaster for Chris Best. I mean, he basically, Nilay was saying, what happens when you get actually racist and homophobic and all sorts of nasty comments on these notes? Are you going to do anything about it? And of course, Best didn't want to talk about anything regarding moderation. In fact, Substack itself, I mean, even as much as I use Substack, that's my platform for my newsletter. Substack itself has a serious issue with people who have, shall we say, controversial and just downright bad opinions. In fact, a lot of people who are just morally questionable have made a ton of money off of Substack, and Substack doesn't seem to care. Now, on the newsletter platform, I kind of feel like, yeah, all right, that's not a huge issue, because with a newsletter, you're only reading it if you want to be there. This isn't something that it's exposed to the entire public and anybody could stumble across, or even worse, things like in Twitter, it's pushed into your feed that you're going to run into when you don't want to. Now, before I get into more detail about that, let me mention this issue about what that Nazi bar is thing, because that's become a meme that's very famous now. And it was posted on Twitter, and I went back to look for it, but unfortunately, some of the tweets have been deleted, and I don't know how long Twitter's going to be around anyway. So I'll just summarize. And it basically tells a story of a guy going into a bar, and the bartender's all reserved and hostile and everything. But then another person comes in and sits down next to the original guy, the narrator. And the bartender takes one look at him and says, "No, get out." And the guy's like, "Why? I didn't do anything. I don't care. Get out." And he even takes a shotgun and puts it on the bar just to make sure the guy leaves. So the narrator says, "What was that about?" And he says, "Well, you couldn't see it, but he had Nazi paraphernalia on him. And if you let them in, the next thing that happens is they bring a friend, and then their friends bring friends. And before you know it, you're a Nazi bar. And then it's trouble." And that's the story. The idea, the moral is it's too late to kick them out. The moral of the story is you can't give hateful people an inch or they will take over the whole place. And he had no desire to do that. So that's the idea of not moderating on a public feed. You let in, I mean, you are defined by what you tolerate. You are defined by the people you do not prohibit from coming in. And Substack already has this problem. As I say, there's a lot of morally questionable people on Substack, but I think they get away with it, again, because you don't read a newsletter unless you're interested, unless you're already engaged and willing to read about it. If you decide you're not interested, you leave and you never have to go back. It's not a problem. And I put in the little TikTok there if you want to see it. But this is the problem with Notes. See, Notes isn't just your notes. Notes is also other notes that an algorithmic feed thinks you might want to see. I mean, if I go to this, let me go to my Substack again and go to Notes here. You see that they have some people that I've subscribed to. They even have a subscribe link. You'll only see the people you subscribe to. But they have others that are people you don't subscribe to that they just think you might want to see, and there's a subscribe link next to them. And okay, that's fine, but what's to prevent there from being something in there that is just reprehensible, that's just offensive? And the interview made it clear that there's nothing to prevent that, and there's never going to be anything to prevent that if the CEO has any say about it. And he didn't say that well at all. In fact, he was trying to walk that fine line and appeal to free speech and no censorship that all these white male tech bros do when they're in the majority and they're just going to make money from clicks and they don't want to prohibit anybody because that could hurt their income. Just come out and admit it. Just come out and admit, no, we're not going to censor people. And if it's there, it's there. And that's just the fact of life. And he couldn't say that. And the most astonishing part is this is the CEO, and he was unprepared for that question when speaking to someone who describes himself as an underrepresented minority. It's a brown person. I mean, it was just astonishing. So, at any rate, you can read the discussion here, and I put it in there, and it's just so typical. So my attitude's going to be, I'll keep an eye on it. I'll see how it plays out. I'll post a note from time to time when I have something to say or something to market. But honestly, I'm already keeping up with the remnants of Twitter. I'm already keeping up with Mastodon. I don't really do much with Facebook. I don't do Instagram. I mean, LinkedIn has things. I look at this stuff. I don't need another product to follow. And I don't need another product where nasty people are going to invade it. And we'll see if that actually happens. If they turn into a Nazi bar, I'm out. Now, I'd hate to have to change newsletter platforms again. I mean, I did that from TinyLetter. I went over to Substack because I like the UI so much better. But we'll see in the future. Okay, enough of that rant too. Next section. I have a new job. Part-time, but I have a job. I actually am going to be a visiting assistant professor of computer science at Trinity College in Hartford. Now, I have to say in Hartford, Connecticut, because there are, in fact, Trinity colleges all over the world. You know, there's lots and lots of them. But this is a liberal arts university with some science and engineering and computer science as well, right in Hartford, and I really like it. It's the students are fun, they're clever. It's not too big a school. There's not too much pressure. But in fact, I had a talk to a professor there who referred to them as it's like Yale but with more chill, which I thought was great. Now, I'm going to be teaching a single course in the fall called Software Design, which from the description of the course doesn't really sound like software design. It sounds like a course teaching them object-oriented programming in Java, which, okay, I've been doing that for about 20 years. I could certainly handle that. I'm going to throw in the functional programming stuff as well, and we'll see how that goes. It's been a while since I've taught undergrads, but I like it. I did a guest lecture for a friend of mine who's already a professor there a couple weeks ago, and that led to this. Now, the funny part is, of course, is that I actually taught there once before. Way back in 1997, I was still at United Technologies Research Center. I was a research scientist, although making a transition into IT, and wound up teaching a course, a sophomore level course in engineering dynamics at Trinity in the engineering department, not in the computer science department. So they actually still have a record of me there. And I figured, okay, well, teaching a class, an undergrad class once every 25 years or so, that ought to be a good idea just to stay in practice. There may be further transitions in that later. They've got big plans. You know, the head of the department's charming and she has all kinds of ideas. And we'll see how that goes. So I thought it might be fun. And my friend Bill Fly, who's also a jarhead, does this as well. So I waved at him. Hi, Bill. Okay, I'll more about that as we get closer to it. For those of you keeping track of the World Championship, the Chess World Championship going on these days in Kazakhstan between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren, Jan from Russia, although playing under a FIDE flag, stateless, if you will, and Ding Liren from China. The match has basically been one game a day with off days. And so far we have had draw and then win by Jan, and then, or Nepo, I guess would be the way to abbreviate his name. And then another draw and then a win by Ding, which balanced it. And then Nepo won another one and then Ding won another one. Today actually is an off day. So that's still where we are. The score is 3-3 out of 14 game match. First player to 7.5 wins. If they're still tied after 14, then they go to rapid and so on. So at any rate, very interesting, having a lot of fun keeping track of it. All the games have been hard fought. These guys are out there to win. They're not just doing energy saving draws and things like that. Even the draws were hard fought. So that's been fun. Let's do our tweets and toots. Although I'm starting to cut way, way back on those tweets. In fact, something I didn't mention, if you're on Twitter and you notice that I unfollowed you, believe me, it's nothing personal. I don't follow anybody on Twitter that I don't already like, but I am really trying to start to disengage. I'm trying to let go of Twitter so that I can eventually release it and then go entirely somewhere else. Elon's just getting worse and worse, and stupid event after stupid event after stupid event. I'm just disgusted with it. At any rate, this was I think it was a tweet because Dad Jokes is still there. Did you know Spider-Man has a winter jacket made entirely of Mediterranean flatbread? It's a pita parka. Yeah, wait a minute. There we go. Okay, clever. I said, sounds like something Peter Parker would say. And then under this, I put the title, I Can Stop at Any Time. And this is Tell Yourself You're Giving Up Twitter. And of course, that's Bilbo trying to let go of the ring so that he could give it to Frodo on his way out the door. And he's having a lot of trouble letting go. Yeah, that hit really close to home. I totally get that. Another good post, Coffee Tea Or, it said all coffee advertisements, or adverts there. So the person's likely to be English. British anyway. He said, well, we have been devoted to creating the perfect cup of coffee since 1982. Every fiber of our being obsesses over every bean. If our coffee ever fell below our impossibly high standards, we would explode immediately. Whereas every tea advertisement is, ooh, tea's nice, isn't it? And yeah, and I have a lot of friends who are what I refer to as coffee snobs, and it's just, they're exactly like that. Whereas people who like tea basically said, yeah, it's a nice cup of tea. Yeah, perfect. Amazing. I admitted that when I was younger and we didn't have Keurig pods, and okay, I'm embarrassed to say I use Keurig pods. Before all that, I'd make a single pot of coffee on Monday, and then on subsequent days, I would put it in a cup and microwave that cup to heat up a cup of coffee. My coffee snob friends would just be appalled. And frankly, I'd be appalled, except in the morning, I'm tired. I don't even taste it. I'm just there for the caffeine. If I have something in the afternoon, then I go, wow, I had no idea this is what coffee tasted like. So the truth is, in the mornings, I would be happy to take my caffeine intravenously if that was an option, but not yet. I love this diagram on nuclear propulsion explained. This was nuclear propulsion on a submarine. It says we got a hot rock and it produces steam, and that leads to sparky, sparky. There's the electricity, and roundy, roundy. There's the little rotor turning. And I wish I had that for my newsletter when I was doing my discussion about the summer jobs I had at Peach Bottom Atomic Power Station, but it just came out this week. But great one. I like that. This was a comment that I thought some of the women I know would really appreciate. It was said, hard to swallow pills. And if you look at the pills, they say, girls actually love nice guys, but you probably aren't as nice a guy as you think you are. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm sure every woman I know knows guys like that. Yeah. This one was titled, now here's a thought, and it says, my home is my castle, which is why I'm digging a moat around it and filling it with piranhas. What could go wrong? It might be hard to get mail delivery, and Amazon may have some issues with that, so it's a value judgment. This one on Far, Far Away. This joke didn't quite work, but I like the try. It said in Back to the Future 3, Doc Brown mistakenly goes back a long time and ends up in a galaxy far, far away. This action accidentally creates a religion known as the Mandalorians as a mistaken interpretation of the phrase man in DeLorean. All right, I'll give it a rim shot. But, it doesn't quite work. I don't know what the actual good gag would be, but it's close, and points for trying. Okay. This great explanation of Dungeons & Dragons stats explained with tomatoes, and I think I've seen this before. I think this is an old one. Strength is being able to crush a tomato, and dexterity is being able to dodge a tomato. Constitution is being able to eat a bad tomato. Intelligence is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. Charisma is being able to sell a tomato-based fruit salad. Yeah, okay. And someone replied, a tomato-based fruit salad would simply be salsa. And the reply was, guys, I found the Bard as well. So enjoy if you're interested. I thought it was clever. And then finally, this proofreading gag, which I'd love my editor friends to see. Sadly, I do most of my proofreading after I hit sned instead of send. Sad but true, spelled wrong. Have a great week, everybody. The video version of this newsletter will be on the Tales from the Jar Side channel today. That'll be out there. Today is Monday, the 17th of April. And last week I did week 2 of the Android Development Bootcamp. This week I'll do week 3. I also have a course on Reactive Spring and Spring Boot on the O'Reilly Learning Platform. And I have a very brief half-day course, deep dive into Spring and Spring Boot. It's a no fluff, just stuff virtual workshop. If you happen to make it by, please say hi. Let me know you're a jarhead. Thank you very much for your time and patience and listening to this. Please, you are encouraged to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I will see everybody again next week. Take care.